My sister begged me not to attend her engagement party. I went anyway. The text arrived on a Tuesday, which felt, in hindsight, like the wrong day for it. Tuesdays were for grocery shopping and dull emails, not for your younger sister asking you, in so many words, to disappear from her life for one evening. Lottie, please don't come Saturday. I know how that sounds. I'll explain everything after. I just need you not to be there. Please. I'm begging you. I read it twice at my kitchen table and bath, tea going cold beside my elbow, and then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder. My name is Charlotte Whitmore, Lottie, to everyone who has ever loved me, and a rotating cast of nicer things to everyone who hasn't. I am 31 years old. I run a small conservation practice out of a converted stable block, restoring old oil paintings for people who inherited more taste than money, and I have spent the better part of the last decade learning how to hold my temper very, very still. It is not a talent I was born with. It is one I built, plank by plank, out of necessity, the way you build a bridge over water you already know is dangerous. My sister, Imogen, is 28, and she was getting engaged on Saturday to a man named Julian Ashworth, at his family's estate in the Cotswolds, in a marquee that had apparently cost more than my car. I rang her immediately. She didn't pick up. I rang again. Straight to voicemail the second time, which meant she'd declined the call, which meant she was watching my name flash on her screen and choosing, quite deliberately, not to hear my voice. So I texted instead. Why? One word. I have learned that with Imogen, brevity gets you further than paragraphs. Our mother always said Imogen absorbed criticism the way linen absorbs wine, permanently, and in a shape you can never quite get out again, so I have made a habit, over the years, of saying less rather than more, and meaning every syllable of it. She didn't answer that night. Or the next. By Thursday I had convinced myself of 6 different explanations, each more elaborate than the last, and discarded every one of them, because none of them sounded like my sister. Imogen does not embarrass easily and she does not frighten easily, and the girl who used to climb onto the garage roof at 14 to watch meteor showers because she refused to be told the sky wasn't for her, that girl did not send pleading texts without a reason underneath it worth being afraid of. On Friday evening she finally called. "You're angry," she said, without a hello. "I'm not angry. I'm confused." Those are different things, and you of all people should know I'm careful about the difference. There was a pause on the line, the particular kind of pause that means someone is standing in a room where they cannot say what they want to say. I can't explain it properly over the phone. Try. Lottie, you asked me not to come to your engagement party, Im. Our engagement party. I am your only sister. Mom is going to be there. I think I've earned an actual sentence. Another pause, longer this time, and when she spoke again her voice had dropped into something I hadn't heard from her in years, not since we were teenagers and she used to creep into my room after Dad's bad nights, when the house had gone quiet in the particular, watchful way that meant something in it had broken. "It's about Julian's family," she said. "About his dad. It's complicated and old, and I don't want to get into it until I understand it myself. I just need this one evening to go smoothly. Please. For me. Does Julian know why you don't want me there?" No. Julian doesn't know anything. That's the whole point. I sat with that for a moment, turning it over the way I turn over a canvas before I decide where the damage runs deepest. "You're not protecting the party," I said slowly. "You're protecting something else." She didn't deny it. That was the detail that stayed with me all night, not the plea itself, but the silence that followed my guess, 3 full seconds of nothing down a phone line, which from Imogen was as good as a confession. "I'll explain everything after," she said again, and then she said goodnight, gently, the way you'd end a call with someone you were worried might do something rash. She wasn't wrong to worry. I have never, in my life, been very good at being told to look away from something that concerns my own family. It is, I think, the one inheritance from our father I never managed to sand down. Underscore 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 underscore. I should say something here about our father, because you cannot understand what I did on Saturday without understanding what happened to him. Edmund Whitmore was, for most of my childhood, a large and laughing man who ran a small property investment firm out of an office above a bakery in Cirencester, and who believed, with the total, uncomplicated faith of a man who has never been badly burned, that partnerships were built on handshakes and history rather than solicitors and small print. In 2009, when I was 14, that faith cost him everything. His business partner at the time was a man called Richard Ashworth. I did not, when Imogen first mentioned Julian's surname 8 months ago, connect the two. Ashworth is not an uncommon name, and my sister had never once, in 3 years of dating him, mentioned meeting his father. I assumed, in the way you assume things you'd rather not examine closely, that it was a coincidence, or that the Richard Ashworth I remembered, the sharp-suited man who used to bring us chocolates from the good shop on Milsom Street and call our father old boy with a fondness that turned out to be entirely rehearsed, was simply a different man with the same 2 words attached to his name. He was not a different man. I found this out properly only 3 days before the party, when I finally did what I should have done the moment Julian's surname first crossed my sister's lips, and typed Richard Ashworth Holdings Cirencester into a search engine at 11 o'clock at night with a glass of wine I wasn't really drinking. The photograph that came up was older, grayer at the temples, but it was him. 15 years hadn't changed the particular way he held his chin, slightly lifted, like a man permanently posing for a portrait only he could see. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because this is not, in the end, a story about a woman losing her composure. It is, if it is about anything, a story about learning to keep it in circumstances specifically designed to make you lose it. What I felt was not rage. It was recognition, cold and total, the way you recognize a smell from childhood before your mind has caught up to naming it. Richard Ashworth had not simply been my father's business partner. He had been the reason my father's business collapsed, the reason our house in Cirencester was sold within 18 months, the reason my mother went from a woman who arranged flowers for the church fete to a woman who worked 2 jobs and flinched at unexpected post. The official story, at the time, was embezzlement, funds diverted from client accounts, discovered during an audit, my father's signature on documents he swore, until the day he died 4 years later, of a heart that had simply had enough of carrying what it was carrying, he had never signed. Nobody believed him. Not fully. Not even, I think, my mother, though she never once said so aloud. Richard Ashworth had walked away from the collapse of Whitmore and Ashworth with his own firm intact, his own name unblemished, and a story that painted my father as a desperate man who'd helped himself to what wasn't his. And now his son was marrying my sister. I did not sleep much that night. But by morning I had made a decision, and it was not the decision Imogen was hoping for. I was going to the party. I want to be clear about something, because it matters to everything that follows. I did not go to Reddington Hall on Saturday to make a scene. I have never, in 31 years, found scenes to be useful. My mother taught me, in the years after my father died, that the people who shout the loudest in a room are very often the people with the least actual power in it, and I had watched too many of her employers, too many solicitors, too many well-dressed men with soft handshakes talk over her simply because she'd raised her voice first and lost the argument by doing it. I went because I loved my sister, and because I could not sit at home in Bath imagining her standing in a marquee beside the son of the man who had destroyed our family, without at least being present enough to see her face if something went wrong. I dressed carefully. Navy, not black. Black would have looked like I'd come for a funeral, which, depending on how the evening went, might not have been inaccurate, but I didn't want to arrive already telegraphing the fight. I did my hair the way our mother always liked it, low and simple, and I told her, when I picked her up at 11:30 that morning, exactly what I'd found. She sat very still in the passenger seat for a long moment, her hands folded over her handbag the way they used to fold over a hymn book. I wondered, she said eventually, if it might be him. Ashworth isn't a name you forget. You never said anything. What was there to say, love? Imogen's happy. I didn't want to be the reason that stopped. Aren't you angry? My mother looked out of the window at the hedgerows going past, and when she answered, her voice had none of the brittleness I'd braced for. I was angry for about 6 years, she said. It didn't bring your father back, and it didn't pay the mortgage. I don't have room for it anymore. But I'll tell you what I do have room for, and that's finding out exactly what that man is doing marrying his son into this family, because men like Richard Ashworth do not do anything without a reason that benefits Richard Ashworth. I have thought about that sentence many times since. My mother, who has every reason in the world to hate that man with her whole chest, had gone, in 15 years, from grief to something far more useful, patience with teeth in it. Reddington Hall sat at the end of a long gravel drive lined with lime trees, the kind of house that photographs beautifully and costs a fortune to heat, honey-colored stone gone gold in the August light. There was a marquee on the south lawn, white canvas and strings of bulb lights not yet lit, a string quartet setting up beside a long table of glasses, waiting staff in black moving between guests with trays of something pale and sparkling. It was, I will admit, a genuinely lovely setting for a genuinely terrible reunion. I saw Imogen before she saw me. She was standing near the marquee entrance in pale green silk, laughing at something Julian had said, one hand resting lightly on his arm, and for just a moment, one clean, unguarded moment, I watched my little sister look happy in a way I hadn't seen since before our father died, and something in my chest folded in on itself with a tenderness that had nothing to do with Richard Ashworth at all. Then she turned, and saw me, and the laughter dropped off her face like a mask coming loose. Lottie. She crossed the grass fast, heels sinking slightly, and caught my arm the moment she reached me, pulling me a few steps away from the crowd with the particular urgency of someone steering a lit match away from dry grass. What are you doing here? I'm your sister. I came to your engagement party. I asked you, I know what you asked. And I've spent the last 3 days finding out exactly why you asked it, so before you send me home, I think you owe me the truth instead of the request. Her face did something complicated then, fear, first, quick and unguarded, and then something that looked almost like relief, as if part of her had been waiting for someone else to say the thing out loud so she didn't have to be the one who said it first. You know, she said. It wasn't a question. I know his name is Richard Ashworth. I know what he did to Dad. What I don't know is what you know, or why you're marrying his son instead of telling me the truth 6 months ago. Because I love Julian, she said, fierce and low, glancing over her shoulder at the marquee. And because Julian isn't his father, and I refuse to let what Richard did be the reason I don't get to be happy. Do you understand that? Do you have any idea how many nights I lay awake deciding whether loving him made me a traitor? I softened, then, because whatever else was happening here, that was true pain, and I have never been able to stay hard-edged in the face of my sister's actual pain, only her evasions. I understand it, I said. I do. But that doesn't explain why you didn't want me here today. If you'd told me all that, I'd have understood. I might not have loved it, but I'd have understood. You didn't ask me to stay away because you were worried about my feelings. You asked because you're frightened of something specific, and I want to know what it is. She looked, for just a second, like she might actually tell me. And then a voice behind us, smooth, warm, entirely too pleased with itself, cut the moment clean in half. There you are, darling. And is this, a pause, deliberate, theatrical? Charlotte. Good Lord. Charlotte Whitmore. I turned, and there he was. Richard Ashworth, 15 years older, silver at the temples now instead of merely distinguished, in a linen jacket that had certainly cost more than my monthly rent, smiling at me with an expression I recognized instantly, because I had spent a good portion of my adolescence learning to read it on my father's face after every meeting they had together, the smile of a man entirely confident that he had already won whatever was about to happen. Mr. Ashworth, I said, and kept my voice as level as still water. It's been a long time. It certainly has. He glanced at Imogen, whose face had gone the careful, arranged blank of someone standing on very thin ice, and then back at me, and something behind his eyes recalibrated, quick as a shutter. I didn't realize you'd be joining us. Neither did Imogen, apparently, I said. But here I am. The next hour passed the way I imagined surgery must pass for the patient, a series of discrete, manageable moments, strung together by the sheer effort of remaining conscious and upright. I drank one glass of champagne very slowly. I let Julian's mother, a slim, silver-blonde woman called Diana with a handshake like a closing door, ask me polite questions about my work and answer them with polite, empty accuracy. I met Julian himself, properly, for the first time and found, against every instinct I'd arrived with, primed as I was to dislike anyone bearing that surname, that I liked him. He had his father's height and his mother's careful manners, but none of the performance. When he shook my hand he held eye contact a beat too long, the way people do when they're nervous about making a good impression rather than skilled at faking one, and he said, "Imogen talks about you constantly. I feel like I already know you," with an earnestness that would have been easy to mock if it hadn't been so plainly genuine. "All good things, I hope," I said. "Mostly. She did mention you once threw a boy's PlayStation into a pond for being cruel to her at school. He deserved it." Julian laughed, a proper laugh, unguarded, and for a second I let myself imagine a version of this story where none of the last 15 years had happened, where I could simply enjoy watching my sister fall in love with a decent man at a beautiful party, and feel nothing more complicated than happiness for her. That version of the afternoon didn't last. It was Mrs. Pruitt who broke it, the Ashworths' housekeeper, a woman somewhere in her 60s with silver-gray hair scraped into a bun and the particular watchfulness of someone who has spent decades being present in rooms while being treated as furniture. I found her near the edge of the marquee, arranging a fresh tray of glasses, and something about the way she glanced at me, quick, assessing, almost startled, made me pause. "You knew my father," I said. It wasn't a guess, not really. There'd been too much recognition in that glance for it to be anything else. She set the tray down carefully before she answered, as if buying herself time. "Mr. Whitmore. Edmund." Her voice, when it came, was quiet, and careful, and threaded with something that sounded remarkably like grief. I worked here before, you know. Before I came to the hall. I was Mr. Ashworth's secretary, in the old office, back when your father and he were partners. My pulse picked up, though I kept my face as still as I could manage. Did you know what happened between them? Mrs. Pruitt glanced past me, towards the marquee, towards the cluster of good linen and champagne flutes, and something in her posture changed, tightened, the way a person tightens before they step off something high. I know what everyone was told happened, she said. Whether that's the same thing as what actually happened is a different question, and not one I've ever been paid to answer. She hesitated, and then added, so quietly I nearly missed it over the string quartet tuning up nearby, there's a study, through the side door past the orangery. Second door on the left. It's usually locked, but not today. We've had the accountants in and out all week, going through boxes for the audit before the wedding trust set up. If I were you, Miss Whitmore, and I had an afternoon to spare and a reason to be curious, I might find myself needing some air near there. I stared at her. Why are you telling me this? Her expression, for the first time since I'd met her, cracked into something unguarded, tired, and old, and carrying weight she'd clearly been carrying alone for a very long time. Because your father was a decent man, she said simply, and decent men don't deserve to be remembered the way this family has let him be remembered. I've kept quiet 15 years because I needed the position and I had a son to raise on my own. I'm not proud of that. But your sister's a lovely girl, and I won't watch her walk into something without at least one person in this house giving her sister the chance to look. She picked the tray back up before I could ask another question, and moved off into the crowd, leaving me standing at the edge of the marquee with my heart going hard and slow against my ribs, and an afternoon suddenly full of a very specific, very dangerous kind of curiosity. I found Imogen before I did anything else. That much, at least, felt non-negotiable. Whatever I was about to do, I wasn't going to do it behind my sister's back, not on top of everything else she was already hiding from me. I found her near the edge of the rose garden, away from the noise, arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth of the afternoon. I need 10 minutes, I said. And I need you to trust me for exactly that long, without asking why. She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face, tired, and frightened, and very young suddenly, the way she used to look at 14 when she'd wake from a bad dream and creep down the corridor to my room, made a decision before her mouth caught up to it. There's a study, she said. Past the orangery. I've seen Richard go in and out of it all week like it holds the crown jewels. Mrs. Pruitt already told me. Imogen's eyes widened slightly. She talked to you? She more than talked to me. I took my sister's hand, quickly, the way I used to when we were small and crossing roads. Whatever's in there, I think you already suspect something's wrong. I think that's the real reason you didn't want me here. Not because you were ashamed of loving Julian. Because you'd started digging, and you weren't ready for me to find out before you had proof. She didn't deny it. Her silence, again, was answer enough, but this time there were tears standing in her eyes when she finally spoke. I found an email a fortnight ago, she whispered. On Julian's laptop, by accident. I wasn't snooping, I promise, it was just open on the screen. From Richard to his solicitor. Something about securing the Whitmore parcel before the wedding proceeds, and I didn't understand it, Lottie, I still don't fully understand it, but it had our name in it, our actual surname, in an email about legal paperwork sent 2 weeks before he'd even met Mum properly, and it frightened me so badly I couldn't sleep for 3 days. The Whitmore parcel, I repeated slowly. Something old surfaced in my memory then, a detail from childhood I'd filed away and forgotten, the way children file away things adults discuss over their heads. Do you remember the land out past Sapperton? The old quarry field, the one Grandad left Dad before he died? Imogen's face went pale. The one Mum still owns. The one Mum still owns, I confirmed, and felt the shape of something enormous and cold settling into place. It's been sitting there for 30 years, useless, because there was never planning permission for anything on it. But there's been talk for the last 2 years about a development corridor going in near Sapperton. If that field suddenly became valuable, then whoever owned it, or married into owning it, or had legal claim to it through a marriage contract, Imogen's voice cracked. Lottie, is that why he wants me to marry Julian? Not because of anything to do with me at all? I don't know yet, I said, and I meant it as gently as I could manage, because I could see exactly how much that question was costing her to ask out loud. But I think it's time we found out. Together, this time. No more secrets between us, whatever we find. She nodded, once, hard, wiping her eyes with the back of her wrist before her mascara could give the moment away to the party still laughing and clinking glasses 50 feet behind us. Together, she said. But Lottie, promise me something. Whatever's in that study, whatever he's done, we don't blow this up in front of 200 guests. Julian doesn't deserve to have his father's sins detonated over his own engagement party. If this is true, we do it properly. Quietly. Like Mum would. I looked at my sister, 28 years old, and frightened, and asking, in that moment, for something far harder and far braver than a scene, and felt something shift in my chest that had nothing to do with anger at all. Like Mum would, I agreed. I promise. The study, when we found it, smelled of old paper and beeswax polish, the particular hush of a room that has been important to someone for a very long time. Filing boxes sat stacked along one wall, evidently pulled from storage for the accountants Mrs. Pruitt had mentioned. Their lids ask you where someone had been through them in a hurry and not bothered to tidy up after. We don't have long, Imogen whispered, already crouching at the nearest box. If Richard finds us in here, then we'll have found exactly what we came for, I said, and started on the box beside her. It took 11 minutes, I know because I watched the carriage clock on the desk the entire time, counting down some internal deadline I hadn't set but felt anyway, before Imogen made a small, sharp sound and went very still. Lottie. I crossed to her side. She was holding a thin manila folder, and inside it, a single sheet of paper, old, the ink slightly faded, dated a full 18 months before the collapse of Whitmore and Ashworth. It was a letter, handwritten, from Richard Ashworth to his own solicitor at the time, discussing, in language dry enough to have been designed to bore anyone into skimming past it, the restructuring of client trust accounts to offset personal liabilities incurred through the Sapperton land acquisition negotiations. He was moving money out of client accounts 18 months before Dad was ever accused of anything, Imogen breathed. This is dated before the audit even happened. Beneath it, clipped together, were 3 more documents, bank transfer records, a second letter referencing EW's signature to be obtained for the year-end reconciliation in a tone that made my skin crawl, because I understood, reading it, precisely what it meant. My father had signed documents he trusted, because he trusted the man who'd handed them to him, and those documents had been used, quietly and deliberately, to make Richard Ashworth's own theft look like Edmund Whitmore's. And beneath that, the piece that made the whole shape of the afternoon finally, sickeningly click into place, was a far more recent document. A draft trust agreement, dated 3 weeks ago, structuring assets to be settled upon marriage between Julian Ashworth and Imogen Whitmore, with a clause, buried in the dry legal language of page 4, granting the Ashworth family trust a controlling interest in any and all land holdings currently registered to the Whitmore estate, including the Sapperton parcel, in the event of marriage. He's not just trying to acquire the land, I said slowly, the pieces settling with a horrible, clean click. He's trying to make sure that if the old fraud ever comes to light, if anyone ever proves what he did to Dad, he'll already own the one asset that could have compensated us for it. He's not marrying you into this family, Im. He's marrying our mother's land into his. Imogen's hands were shaking. Julian doesn't know any of this. I'd stake my life on it. He's not like his father, Lottie, he's genuinely, I believe you, I said, and I did. But his father has spent 15 years building a story where our family are the villains and his is the victim, and he's about to finish the job by marrying his son into the very family he ruined, and taking the last thing we have left while he does it. We need to. The door opened. Richard Ashworth stood in the frame, champagne glass in one hand, his expression sliding, in the space of a single second, from polite surprise to something far colder and far more calculating. Well, he said softly, closing the door behind him with a click that sounded, in that quiet room, very much like a lock turning. I did wonder how long it would take. I have thought a great deal, since that afternoon, about what I might have done in that room if I had been 14 again, or even 24, if I had still been the girl who watched her father's business collapse and her mother's back bend under the weight of it, without yet having learned the particular discipline of staying still while your blood runs hot. I think I would have shouted. I think I would have thrown something. I think, frankly, I would have deserved to, and I do not think anyone with a shred of humanity in them would have blamed me for it. But I was not 14, and I had promised my sister something on the lawn 20 minutes earlier, and so instead I set the folder down on the desk, squared it neatly with the edge, and looked at Richard Ashworth the way I imagine my father must have looked at him once, before he learned better. How long did you think it would take for what, exactly, Mr. Ashworth? His eyes flicked to the folder, to Imogen's white face, and something in his shoulders settled, the way a man settles when he decides a confrontation can't be avoided and resolves, instead, to win it. For someone in this family to start asking the right questions, he said. I confess I rather expected it to be your mother, eventually. I underestimated the daughters. You framed my father, I said. Not a question. I wanted him to hear it stated as plainly as the fact that it was. That's a very dramatic way of putting it. Is there a less dramatic way to put moving stolen money through his signature? Something flickered across his face, not guilt. I don't think Richard Ashworth was capable of guilt in any form I'd recognize, but a kind of irritation, the look of a man being made to explain arithmetic he considers beneath him. Your father, he said, was a wonderful man to have a pint with and an utterly hopeless businessman. He signed whatever I put in front of him because he trusted me, and I will confess that I made use of that trust when my own liabilities became inconvenient. I am not proud of it. But I want you to understand something, Charlotte, because I don't think you do. None of that was personal. Edmund and I were friends. What happened because the business needed someone to blame, and he was, unfortunately, the more convenient shape for that blame to take. He died believing he'd failed his own family, I said, and for the first time that afternoon I felt my composure genuinely strain against its own seams. He died still trying to work out what he'd signed that could have ruined us. You let him die not knowing. And what would you have had me do? Richard's voice sharpened now, the pleasantries finally dropping away entirely. Confess, and go to prison, and leave my own wife and son with nothing? I have spent 15 years building something out of that mess, Charlotte. A business. A family. A future for my son that doesn't have a stain on it. I am not going to unpick that now because two girls found an old folder in a filing box. You're not just protecting the past, Imogen said, finding her voice at last, low and shaking but steady underneath it. You're using my marriage to take the one thing my family has left. That's not protecting your son's future. That's stealing from mine. The Sapern land is worth considerably more to this family's future than it will ever be worth sitting fallow under your mother's name, Richard said coolly. I'm simply ensuring the assets are structured sensibly, as any father would for his son's marriage. You mean you're ensuring that if your fraud ever comes to light, I said, and someone tries to claim what our family's owed, you'll already own the only thing worth claiming. The silence that followed that sentence told me I'd landed it exactly where it needed to land, because Richard Ashworth, for the first time since he'd walked into that room, didn't have an immediate answer ready. It was Imogen who broke it, and what she said next surprised me more than anything Richard had confessed. I'm not signing that trust agreement, she said, quietly, but with a steadiness that made her sound, in that moment, entirely like our mother. Not the version with the Sapperton clause in it. And you're going to help me explain to Julian exactly why, because if I have to do it alone, Mr. Ashworth, I promise you I will not be nearly as measured about it as my sister has been. What happened next was not the scene I had half expected when I drove out to Reddington Hall that morning. No shouting across a marquee, no champagne flung, no dramatic unmasking in front of 200 guests balancing canapes. It was, instead, something quieter and considerably more frightening for Richard Ashworth, I suspect, than any public confrontation could ever have been. We asked Julian to join us. He came into the study looking faintly bewildered, glancing between his father's rigid posture and Imogen's pale, resolute face, and something in his expression, quick, alert, already braced for bad news before any had been given, told me that whatever else he was not a fool, and not, whatever his father might have hoped, entirely unobservant. What's going on? He said. Imogen didn't soften it. I watched her decide, in real time, not to soften it, and felt a rush of something fiercely proud watching her do it. Your father defrauded my father 15 years ago, she said. He let my dad take the blame for it, and it destroyed our family, and it's part of why my dad died young. And he's been structuring our marriage trust to make sure he keeps the one piece of land my family has left, in case the truth ever comes out and someone tries to make him pay for it. Julian's face went through several things in quick succession. Disbelief, first, the automatic flinch of a son defending a father out of pure reflex, and then, as his eyes moved to Richard and found no denial waiting there, something closer to horror. Dad, he said. Tell me that's not true. It's considerably more complicated than she's making it sound, Richard began. Is it not true, Julian said, that you're the reason her father lost everything? The silence stretched long enough that it became its own answer. I was protecting this family, Richard said finally, and for the first time all afternoon his composure genuinely cracked, something older and more defensive showing through the linen jacket and the practiced charm. Everything I have built, I built to give you a life without the shame of what nearly happened to us. I am not going to apologize for that. You don't have to apologize to me, Julian said, and his voice, when it came, was very quiet and very final in a way that told me everything I needed to know about the sort of man my sister had chosen to marry. You have to apologize to them. And you're going to rewrite that trust agreement without the Sapperton clause, tonight, before a single other person leaves this house, because I am not marrying into a family whose foundation is built on someone else's ruin. If you don't, I'll tell every single person in that marquee myself, and I don't care what it costs either of us. Richard looked at his son for a long moment, searching, I think, for some sign that this was a bluff, some crack he could work his way back into, and found none. Whatever else could be said about Richard Ashworth, he was not, in the end, a stupid man, and he understood, watching his son's face, that he had finally run out of rooms to talk his way out of. "Fine," he said at last, the word coming out clipped and small, entirely unlike the smooth, confident voice that had greeted me on the lawn 2 hours earlier. "Fine. The clause comes out." "And," I said, because I had been quiet long enough and there was one more thing that mattered more, in the end, than the land ever had, "you're going to write down, in your own hand, exactly what you told us in this room. What actually happened with the accounts 15 years ago. Not for the police, not necessarily, that's a decision for my mother to make, and it's hers alone to make it, in her own time. But you owe my father's name the truth, on paper, whatever happens to it afterwards. He died still believing he'd failed us. I want that undone, even if it's 15 years too late to matter to him." Richard's jaw worked for a moment, some final, futile resistance flickering and then, visibly, giving out. "Yes," he said. "All right." We did not tell the party. That had been Imogen's condition from the start, and I understood it better with every hour that passed, not because the truth deserved to be buried, but because 200 guests eating canapés on a summer lawn had done nothing to earn the front row seat to 15 years of grief finally coming due. Some reckonings are owed to the people who lived them, not to an audience. Instead, the party continued outside, string quartet and bulb lights and champagne, entirely unaware that in a quiet study past the orangery, an old and terrible debt had just been called in. Mrs. Pruitt brought tea instead of more champagne for the four of us once the worst of it had passed, setting the tray down without a word, though the look she gave me on her way out, steady, grateful, unmistakably relieved, told me she already knew exactly what had happened, and had been hoping, for 15 quiet years, that someone would finally make it happen. Richard wrote his account by hand, at the desk, in a silence so total I could hear the string quartet faintly through the window the entire time. When he finished, he slid the pages across to me without meeting my eyes, and I folded them carefully into my handbag beside the original documents, because I had already decided, somewhere in the last hour, exactly what I intended to do with them. Not expose him publicly. Not press for prosecution, not yet, not without my mother's blessing, because it was her grief to spend as she saw fit, and I had learned enough that afternoon about the cost of decisions made in anger to want to make that one for her. But I intended to take it all, the letters, the transfer records, the confession, to a solicitor of our own the following week, and find out, properly and legally, exactly what my family was owed, and exactly what a court might say about a 15-year-old fraud finally brought into daylight. "What happens now?" Julian asked quietly, once his father had left the room, visibly smaller than he'd been when he entered it. "Now," Imogen said, and reached for his hand, "we go back out to our own engagement party, and we get through it, because 200 people came a long way to celebrate us, and none of this is their fault, or yours. And tomorrow, we start figuring out what a marriage looks like when it isn't standing on ground your father tried to steal." "You're still going through with it," I said. It wasn't quite a question, but I wanted to hear her say it out loud, to be certain it was truly her choice and not simply momentum carrying her forward. Imogen looked at Julian for a long moment, really looked at him, the way you look at someone when you're deciding, consciously, whether the last hour has changed what you feel or simply changed what you now understand about the world he came from, and then back at me. "I'm marrying Julian," she said. "Not his father. Not his family's money. Him. That hasn't changed, Lottie. If anything, watching him choose us over his own dad in that room, that's the surest thing I've ever seen from him." She squeezed his hand. "But I'm not signing a single piece of paper that has Richard Ashworth's fingerprints on it, and I'm not walking down an aisle pretending today didn't happen. We do this properly, or we don't do it at all. Julian nodded, steady, and something in his face in that moment reminded me, oddly, of the way our own father used to look at our mother across a crowded room, the particular, unshowy certainty of a man who has already decided, privately, that he'd choose this woman in any version of any room he ever found himself in. I believed him. That mattered more than I expected it to. We went back out to the marquee not long after, the four of us, composed and smiling in the particular, practiced way people manage when they've just weathered something enormous and are determined not to let it show on the surface. My mother found me almost immediately, reading something in my face that I hadn't managed to fully smooth away. "Tell me," she said quietly, drawing me a little apart from the crowd, near the roses where Imogen and I had stood an hour and a lifetime earlier. So I told her. All of it, the study, the letters, Richard's confession written out in his own careful hand, the trust clause that had nearly signed our family's last remaining land straight into his. I watched her face while I spoke, braced for grief, or fury, or the particular brittleness I remembered from the year after Dad died, and found, instead, something far steadier. 15 years, she said, when I'd finished, and there were tears standing in her eyes, but her voice didn't shake. 15 years I've been telling myself it didn't matter anymore, that being angry wouldn't bring him back, and do you know, love, I think I actually half believed it, some days. She wiped her eyes carefully, mindful of her mascara, entirely her daughter's mother in that gesture. Your father would be so proud of you. Both of you. Not for exposing him, for not exposing him, out there, in front of everyone. For doing it properly. That's harder than shouting. That's so much harder than shouting. What do you want to do with it? I asked. The documents. It's your decision, Mum. Whatever you decide, I'll back you. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the marquee, the string quartet, her younger daughter laughing softly at something Julian had said, visibly trying, with real effort, to let the last hour go long enough to enjoy the evening she'd been planning for months. I want it in writing, properly, with a solicitor, she said finally. I want Whitmore's name cleared, on paper, somewhere official, so that if anyone ever looks up what happened to your father, they find the truth instead of Richard Ashworth's version of it. But I don't think I want a trial, Lottie. I don't want to spend the next 2 years of my life in a courtroom being cross-examined about your father's signature. I've given that man 15 years of my grief already. I'm not sure I've got 2 more to give him in a witness box. That's entirely fair, I said, and meant it completely. But I do want that land, she added, with a small, tired smile that was nonetheless the first genuinely fierce thing I'd seen on her face in years. Every last acre of it. And if there really is a development corridor coming through Sapperton, I intend to sell every scrap of it to the highest bidder and spend the money on something entirely frivolous, in your father's memory. He always did want a proper holiday. Somewhere warm. Somewhere he never got to go. I laughed, actually laughed, the first unguarded sound I'd made all day, and put my arm around her shoulders, and for a moment we simply stood there together at the edge of the party, watching the sun start to lower over the lime trees, saying nothing at all, because nothing needed to be said. It is worth saying, I think, that the rest of the evening was, against every possible expectation, genuinely lovely. Julian gave a toast that made half the marquee cry, about how he'd never met anyone who made him want to be a better man simply by watching how she moved through the world, and I watched Imogen's face while he spoke and saw, for the first time all day, the pure and uncomplicated happiness I'd glimpsed from a distance that morning, before any of it had gone wrong. Richard Ashworth stood near the back of the marquee for most of the toasts, quieter than I'd ever imagine a man like him being in a room full of people whose good opinion he'd spent his whole life cultivating, and I found, watching him, that I felt considerably less than I'd expected to feel. Not forgiveness, I don't think I'll ever manage that, not fully, and I'm not certain it's owed. But something calmer than the anger I'd carried with me up the gravel drive that morning. A kind of settling. The particular, hard-won piece of a debt finally, properly acknowledged, even if it could never be fully repaid. Mrs. Pruitt caught my eye once, across the lawn, as the bulb lights came on properly for the first time against the darkening sky, and gave me the smallest of nods, the kind of gesture that says, without a single word needing to pass between two people, "I saw what you did, and I am glad someone finally did it." I drove my mother home a little after midnight, the fields dark and silvered with moonlight on either side of the lane, and she fell asleep somewhere around Cirencester with her head against the window, the way she used to when Imogen and I were small and she'd drive us home from evenings out, exhausted and content in equal measure. I glanced at her in the passing streetlight and thought about my father, about the version of that evening he never got to see, his younger daughter engaged to a decent man, his elder daughter finally, properly vindicating him after 15 years of silence, his wife asleep in a car with something close to peace on her face for the first time in longer than I could remember. I thought, too, about the girl I'd been at 14, watching our world collapse from the top of the stairs while the adults argued in low, urgent voices below, certain, in the specific and total way only children can be certain of things, that nothing would ever be put right again. She'd been wrong, that girl. It had taken 15 years, and a phone call I nearly ignored, and a locked study past an orangery, and every ounce of restraint I had ever managed to teach myself, but it had, in the end, been put right. Not perfectly. Not completely, some things, I think, never fully mend, not the kind our father's death had left in us. But properly. Honestly. In a way I thought, driving through the dark lanes with my mother sleeping softly beside me, he would have recognized, and been proud of, and perhaps, knowing him, knowing the enormous, uncomplicated warmth he'd carried even through the worst of it, even have found a way to forgive. My sister rang me 2 days later, once the last of the wedding guests had gone home and the marquee had been taken down off the lawn at Reddington Hall. "Thank you," she said, "for not making it a scene." "Thank you for trusting me enough to let me in, eventually," I said. "That's the part that mattered more." "I did beg you not to come, though," she said, and I could hear the smile creeping back into her voice, tentative but real. "For the record. I want that on the official account of events." "You did," I agreed. "And I came anyway. I'd do it again, Im. Every single time. That's rather the whole point of being someone's sister." She laughed, properly, warmly, and on the other end of the line I heard, faintly, Julian's voice asking who she was talking to, and her answer, "Just my sister, the one who saved my life and completely ruined my engagement party and somehow still made it the best day of my life," and I sat in my quiet kitchen and bath, tea going cold beside my elbow exactly as it had a week and a half earlier, and understood, finally, that the story I'd been so afraid of walking into had turned out to be, after everything, a story about being let back in.